In the tumultuous landscape of the Wild West, women found themselves at the intersection of cultural collision and brutal warfare. As the frontier expanded and the 19th century began, conflicts between settlers and Native American tribes escalated. Women, whether as homesteaders, missionaries, or community anchors, became emblematic of a new social order. The targeting of women was not a matter of collateral damage. It was a deliberate tactic employed by combatants on both sides. For the Apache, acts of aggression toward women were loaded with symbolic meaning. Women represented the future and the continuity of settler communities, and by attacking them, the Apache aimed to undermine the very foundation of the encroaching society. This calculated strategy was intended to inflict psychological damage, spreading terror beyond the battlefield and disrupting the social fabric that underpinned the settler way of life. Beyond the romanticized images of heroism and conquest lies a legacy of calculated violence. A legacy in which the targeting of women reveals the depths to which both sides were willing to go in order to assert their claims and secure their survival. The story of these women, caught in the crossfire of an era defined by brutality and resistance, serves as a stark testament to the enduring impact of these conflicts on the very fabric of society. In the midst of relentless raids and shifting battle lines, a particularly harrowing facet of the conflict emerged: the systematic kidnapping and captivity of women. These abductions were not incidental acts of violence, but deliberate strategies aimed at undermining the social fabric of settler communities. Women viewed as the bearers of future stability and continuity were forcibly removed from the sanctity of their homes, their lives abruptly transformed by the brutality of war. The tactics employed during these raids were ruthlessly efficient. Apache warriors would descend upon vulnerable homesteads, seizing women with little regard for the ensuing trauma. Once captured, these women were thrust into a world of uncertainty and dislocation. The experience of captivity was both a physical ordeal and a deep psychological wound. A forced immersion into an alien culture where every day brought the constant threat of further abuse or assimilation. One of the most emblematic stories to emerge from this grim chapter is that of Olive Oatman. Captured at a tender age, her life was irrevocably altered by the harsh realities of captivity, marked by a ritualistic tattoo, a visible sign of her coerced integration into Apache society. Her experience resonated far beyond her personal ordeal, becoming a symbol of the broader suffering inflicted during these tumultuous times. One of the most infamous and brutal practices attributed to them was scalping. While scalping existed in various cultures, the Apache warriors perfected it, using it as both a symbol of power and a psychological weapon in their prolonged battle against settlers and military forces. Scalping was not just an act of violence, it was a strategic move with deep cultural significance. For the Apache, the act of taking a scalp symbolized a warrior's victory over an enemy, marking their triumph in battle. It served as a public warning to those who might consider challenging their tribe. The scalp, often displayed proudly, became a reminder of the price of defying the Apache and the savage retribution that awaited any who dared to cross them. However, scalping was not limited to their enemies. It became a symbol of fear and terror in the American Southwest, where settlers were left with the horrifying reality of a war that was relentless and personal. As more settlers encroached on Apache land, the practice became more widespread. While it was initially a method of warfare during raids, it later took on a more gruesome purpose, as a tool of intimidation and retaliation. The psychological toll on the victims and the families of those who lost their scalps was immense. The thought of being scalped, a gruesome and permanent reminder of death, haunted many. The scalp, often taken from a freshly killed victim, would be proudly displayed, further deepening the psychological warfare. It wasn't just about physical death, it was about fear. Among the various harsh practices attributed to the Apache warriors, whipping and beating were also employed as forms of punishment and control. Whipping and beating were often carried out during raids or conflicts with settlers, but they were also common forms of discipline within the Apache community itself. These punishments were meant to remind both enemies and tribe members of the consequences of disobedience or dishonor. When an Apache warrior was punished in such a manner, it served as a symbol of their failure to meet the strict expectations of the tribe. For enemies, these punishments were used to break the spirit and force submission. Whipping and beating were often employed on captured enemies, particularly when prisoners were taken during raids. These punishments were meant not only to extract information, but also to demoralize the enemy. The Apache understood the psychological effects of such violence. The harshness of the punishment, particularly in front of others, was a way to break down any resistance and force a swift surrender or compliance. At times, women and children were also victims of such punishments, though the circumstances varied depending on the tribe and the situation. For example, if an enemy woman or child was captured during a raid, they might be subjected to physical punishment as a means of showing power over the enemy or deterring future conflict. The punishments served as warnings to those who might consider crossing the Apache. They were not simply about causing pain, but about sending a message. The Apache were not a people to be trifled with, and those who defied them would face the consequences. In this sense, whipping and beating were tools of power used to maintain order, enforce respect, and deter any opposition. The atrocities committed against women during this period reached depths that were both shocking and designed to instill unyielding fear. These acts were not merely incidental collateral damage, but were deliberate strategies aimed at demoralizing entire communities and disrupting the very foundation of settler life. Accounts from survivors and contemporary observers describe scenes that seem almost beyond belief, a calculated blend of physical torture and psychological terror. The violence inflicted upon women was multifaceted. In many instances, the brutality took the form of extreme physical mutilation, where every cut and mark was intended to serve as a lasting symbol of defeat and subjugation. This was not random savagery. It was a meticulous process intended to erase identities and reduce the human spirit to a state of perpetual vulnerability. The methods employed were as varied as they were horrifying. Some reports detail the use of traditional techniques meant to inflict prolonged pain, a cruel reminder of the enemy's power and the futility of resistance. Others describe the marking of captives in ways that ensured their suffering was visible to all, a constant, indelible scar that spoke to the permanence of the violence endured. The imagery of such acts often exceeds what words can adequately convey, painting a picture of a time when the boundaries of acceptable cruelty were not just tested, but shattered. For many captive women, the ordeal did not end with their abduction. Rather, it marked the beginning of a long, harrowing journey defined by loss, forced assimilation, and enduring trauma. Once taken from their familiar lives, these women were thrust into an existence that was unrecognizable, a world where the very essence of their identity was challenged by constant uncertainty and exploitation. In captivity, they faced a relentless struggle not only against physical hardships, but also against the psychological erosion of self and cultural dislocation. Within these confines, the fate of each woman was dictated by a complex interplay of survival and subjugation. Some were forced into new roles within Apache society, their lives irreversibly altered by the customs and expectations imposed upon them. Others endured unspeakable hardships, their experiences marked by isolation and the loss of any semblance of the life they once knew. Over time, the scars of captivity, both visible and hidden, became symbols of a broader tragedy, reflecting the deep-seated wounds inflicted by the collision of two cultures at war. The tragic fate of these women stands as a poignant reminder of how the brutality of conflict can transform lives in ways that echo long after the fighting has ended, leaving behind a legacy of sorrow and resilience intertwined. The violent episodes of the Wild West, marked by the relentless brutality of the Apache Wars and the profound suffering of women caught in the crossfire, offer enduring lessons about the cost of cultural collision and the extremes of human behavior. The legacy of this turbulent period is etched into the history of the American frontier, a reminder that behind every myth of rugged heroism lies a deeper, more painful reality of loss, trauma, and the struggle for survival. As we reflect on these events, we confront a history that resists simplification into neat narratives of good versus evil. The lessons gleaned from this bloody past are manifold. They compel us to acknowledge that in times of existential crisis, the boundaries of morality can be distorted, leading ordinary people to commit extraordinary acts of cruelty. They also highlight the tragic consequences of marginalizing vulnerable groups, especially women, whose suffering becomes a silent testament to the human cost of conflict. In re-examining these events with honesty and nuance, we are urged to embrace a more comprehensive understanding of history, one that does not shy away from its darkest chapters, but rather learns from them. Only by confronting the full scope of our past can we hope to forge a future defined not by cycles of retribution, but by a commitment to empathy, justice, and reconciliation.